Hi folks, I want to start by talking about three families or groups of theories that have dominated our way of thinking about human learners for well over 100 years. And the first of these groups of theories is behaviorism. And then there's information processing, which became cognitive science, and finally constructivism. And as we moved from one group of theories to the next, we gradually expanded our view of what human learners are like. The behaviorists, who were first, from about, just before 1900 to in the 1950s and even into the 60s, they dominated psychology, looked at human learners like rats and pigeons. In other words, people learned exactly the same way that animals did. They respond to stimuli. They avoid pain. They move toward pleasure. It's all about punishment and reward. And then in the 50s, the information processing theorists came along and said, no, people are much more complicated than that. We are information processors. We take in information in a variety of different ways and we process it. And that's what learning is. And then we store it. So people are like computers. And so their metaphor for the human learner was like a computer. And in fact, they did their experiments using computers, figuring that if they could produce a certain effect in a computer, then that was the same process by which these effects happened in human beings. And then after them, in the late 70s, the constructivists really became powerful. And they said, no, people are not just information processors. They're information builders, they're knowledge builders and creators, that every human being takes in things from their environment and then reorganizes it and builds their own knowledge structure, their way of thinking about the world. So as you can see, as we moved throughout the last century, our views of what happens when people learn became increasingly complex, starting with very simple stimulus response views all the way up to the complexity of individual differences in knowledge and how different people perceive exactly the same situation. So let's start with the behaviorists. Now, behaviorism is not my very favorite theory of learning, as I bet you could tell, but it's really easy to be critical of the behaviorists. I mean, who wants to think of themselves as like a rat or a pigeon? But you really have to understand the historical background they were coming from. Behaviorism was the very first attempt to make psychology a science. Before the behaviorists, psychology and philosophy were essentially the same thing. It was just ideas, and people argued logically about how people thought or felt or learned or whatever. But the behaviorists wanted to make psychology a science. And their drive to make it a science arises from the fact that in the early 1900s, for the whole first half of the century, science was seen as the thing that was going to save our world. And that seems kind of naive from our point of view. Yes, science is very important, but we're a lot more skeptical about it than they were. But you have to look at what was happening in that first 50 years of the 1900s. All the things that happened that changed people's lives. And here's pictures of just a few of them. Telephones and automobiles were actually invented before 1900, but they became available to ordinary human beings in the early 1900s. For the first time, you could talk to somebody far away. You could drive in an hour the distance it would have taken you half a day to go on horseback. And so science changed people's lives. Medical advances were huge. Insulin was invented, and it was the first human hormone that was extracted and used to cure diabetes, type 1 diabetes. Before that, people who had diabetes simply died in 2 years. Likewise, antibiotics were invented. And this is a poster from World War II saying, thanks to penicillin, he'll come home. If you've ever had a strep throat, you know that now you go to the doctor, you get an antibiotic for your strep throat or for your kid's strep throat, and everybody's feeling better in about 24 hours. But before antibiotics, kids, especially who got strep throat, had a good chance, a 25% chance or so of dying. So antibiotics changed how we dealt with disease hugely. the power involved. There was radio, of course, the first mass entertainment medium. Refrigeration for the home was invented after 1900, and for the very first time, ordinary human beings could store food, could freeze food, could eat things out of season, and that changed our diets enormously. And of course, then there's the airplane, which continued the work of the car, so that now we could travel from one coast to the other, a journey that took the pioneers months, and we could do it in 5 or 6 hours. So science was simply amazing, and you can understand why they were hoping that if they could make psychology a science, that we could predict and ultimately influence how people learned and how they thought and how they acted, which is still something we'd like to do, because people don't learn as well as we'd hope they would, and they certainly don't act as well as we'd hope they would. And so the behaviorists were really hoping that if they could make something measurable and observable and experimental, that they could find out the secrets to human development and learning and personality. The basis for behaviorism is classical conditioning, which was discovered by Ivan Pavlov actually in the late 1800s, and he was a scientist working on digestion in dogs. He was measuring dogs' salivation in response to food, and in order to do that, he would have all his dogs lined up in the kennel with the apparatus on them to measure the saliva that they produced, and he would ring a bell or a buzzer or something to tell his lab assistants to feed the dogs all at the same time so that he could measure things. Well, being a very good scientist, he noticed something odd was happening. Normally, dogs just salivate when they see or smell food, but his dogs were starting to salivate when they heard the bell before the food ever came. And again, being a very good scientist, he realized this was an important discovery and spent the rest of his life looking at classical conditioning. Here is the basis of classical conditioning. It is an association between two stimuli causing a new response. And what happens is you start with an unconditioned or natural stimulus and an unconditioned or natural response. And dogs naturally start to salivate when they see or smell food. The food is a natural unconditioned stimulus. The salivation is an unconditioned response. Dogs do not naturally start to salivate when they hear a bell ring. That's not built into their genetic code. In my dog's case, they do not naturally start looking for food when they hear a refrigerator open. That's not a natural thing for dogs, but my dogs sure do. And that's what happens. Stage 2, what happens is the natural unconditioned stimulus, the food, becomes associated with the neutral stimulus, the bell in this case. They always happen at the same time. So the dog begins to show the same response to the bell that it would to the food. So that response becomes, we call it conditioned. So the dog has now been conditioned to respond to the bell with salivation the same way he does respond to food. Now there's a couple things to notice about classical conditioning. It's not conscious. The dog is not thinking, oh, when the bell rings, the food is going to come, because salivation is an unconscious response. And most classical conditioning is that way too. It all happens at below the level of thought, which is why working with rats and pigeons works out so well, because they don't think the way we do. And the other thing to notice about classical conditioning is this is still a really important thing to understand in psychology, and especially in education. For example, think about the kid who goes to school for years and doesn't do very well. Over and over and over. He gets bad grades. He's told he's not trying hard enough lots of times. Sometimes he gets in trouble because most kids would rather be a troublemaker than be thought stupid. Or maybe he just sits there and quietly fails year after year after year. That kid leaves school as soon as he can because it's an unpleasant place to be. And not only that, but that kid grows up to be a parent who, when their own child is in school and the teacher calls and says, I want to have a conference with you, it's really difficult for that parent to go back to that school
because they have been classically conditioned to see school as an aversive place, to see school as an unpleasant place. So when they walk into school, they get all those same emotions and feelings and sensations that they had when they were there and they were failing. So that's one reason that classical conditioning is still so important to us in schools. We have to work very hard not to make schools a place where so many aversive things happen that children begin to associate school with bad emotions. Another thing that's extremely relevant is I know that all of you have probably worked with teachers or trainers or other professionals who are aversive to using technology. And it's partly because of the same response. We all know when we use technology, things go wrong, okay? You just have to get used to that idea. About, who knows, about 10% of the time maybe, the tech doesn't work the way it's supposed to work. And when you're trying new technology, it can be really frustrating to get it to work, okay? And so people who maybe taught before there was much technology, and started trying to use different technology without the right support, without the room and permission to fail, who, like the first time they tried to use technology in a lesson, it fell apart and they felt like a real failure standing up there in front of all those students. They're going to, if that happens to them more than a few times, doesn't take that long, they're going to develop what we call an aversive response to technology. It's exactly like classical conditioning. They begin to associate the use of technology with that feeling of failure and embarrassment and all the physical sensations that go with that. So you can see why classical conditioning is still extremely relevant to us in education.